It's an unusual topic for a Gelugpa Dharma Center, and it's not. I'm not an expert on Mipam, right? I haven't actually studied with Nyingma lamas. I'm not a practitioner of the great perfection, Dzogchen. I suggested this topic mainly to learn to learn something about I mean, it's not that I know nothing about it, but there's like somewhat of a challenge to myself to learn something more. I've known for some time that Mipam is one of the most extraordinary Tibetan scholars outside the Gelugpa tradition. And some people argue that after Tsongkhapa, he's maybe the most important scholar. We'll see why you could make that kind of argument. But I have suggested the topic of teaching Mipam to other people, other Dharma centers, and been told that that was unsuitable because he doesn't follow in the lineage of Tsongkhapa, Je Rinpoche, and in fact, criticizes Je Rinpoche on several matters. So I'm going to, I wanted to start by just saying, I'm glad you were willing to go down this road with me and learn something outside the box, so to speak, the Gelugpa box, learn something together. So I'm going to show a few slides, maybe 4 or 5 slides. And then after I do that and talk about them, I'm going to unshare my screen and then reshare it again with a text by Douglas Duckworth, who is an expert on Nyingma, and in which I've highlighted many things. And at least for tonight, that's what I'm going to do, is kind of go through the first part of that text together to sort of begin to get a feeling of who Mipam is and why he might be important. And then in the next class, we'll dig pretty significantly into Mipam's philosophy. And then maybe in that class or the following one, by the time we're finished, we'll actually spend a good bit of time looking at translated texts by Mipam, which I think are quite beautiful and profound, and worth our time to look at. And of course, all in translation by Douglas Duckworth, who really knows what he's doing. So this is my first slide. I just wanted to say a few introductory things. If you've come to these talks with me before, other years, you probably heard me say that, right, a lot of this is about emptiness and the ultimate nature of reality and how it relates to the conventional nature of reality, and how to do various kinds of advanced practices, in particular, what it means to realize emptiness, or exactly what emptiness is. And of course, this is what I've sort of specialized in as a scholar. My very first book was Compassion, a Tibetan Analysis, which is a study of the Chandrakirti's homage at the beginning of the Madhyamakavatara to compassion as being crucial at the beginning, middle, and end of the path. And that word Nyingche in Tibetan, Karuna in Sanskrit, everybody translates as compassion, but I think of it as loving care or loving kindness. That's not the usual translation, but it's, derived from the Karuna. The Sanskrit is derived from the verbal. They say in Sanskrit, every word is derived from a verb. And so karuna, compassion, is derived from the verb kur, which means to do or act or make. So it's an active. The idea of karuna is some active care, right? And the idea of kindness, I think, is really important in conveying then what the sense of compassion really is. Yeah, I've heard His Holiness the Dalai Lama say that if you do a certain practice for, 2 or 3 years, and you don't find in honest introspection that you're becoming a kinder person, then maybe you should be doing something else. Because that's really the whole point of this. And to become kinder people. And you know how much he's emphasized, His Holiness the Dalai Lama has emphasized this in the sense that, well, the number of people who are going to directly realize emptiness is limited, and the goal of world peace is advanced much more by focusing on kindness, which can be accessed universally. So I just like to start by saying that we're not going to be talking about compassion or kindness a lot, but everything should be ultimately in the service of that. The second thing I wanted to mention is that my whole way of thinking about what's going on in Buddhism is heavily derived from the idea that Buddhism is built on a medical metaphor or a therapeutic metaphor. It's really well known that, to be a Buddhist means to take refuge in the three jewels, and we take refuge in the Buddha as though a doctor, the Dharma, like a medicine, or maybe like a pharmacy full of medicines from which the doctor can choose. And then in refuge in the Sangha, as we'll say, the loving care of our nurses or something like that. And this metaphor, which is, not made up, it's I think intrinsic to how Buddhists understand their own world system. It gives us an understanding of why different teachers teach different things to different people at different times in different ways. The saying is that the Buddha's teachings have 84,000 remedies in them. That's the theoretical scope of the pharmacy, 84,000 different medicines. And of course, some are ultimately, the deepest sorts of cures, but that doesn't mean that, say, for example, teaching emptiness is the best thing for each person. Do you know what I'm saying? Some people, many people are not helped by it, even though in the long run, maybe they will be. But in the meantime, they need to think more about impermanence or death or reverence, that there's so many, maybe they need to practice loving kindness. And maybe the way to do that is to not focus on emptiness for the time being. So if you start with that idea, then you can begin to understand how, in general, and not pervasive, because Buddhists are human beings all over the world, but in general, the tendency in Buddhism has been to be relatively tolerant of Buddhists who hold other views. This has obviously not always been the case in Tibet, and it's not always been the case in any Buddhist country if you look closely. But if you compare it to the history of religious wars in Europe, I think you do get a sense that there's a different sense that, like, okay, those people over there have a certain medicine, and it might not be ultimately the best one, but as long as it's not harming people, maybe it's the best medicine for those particular people at this particular time, right? And so we don't have to burn them at the stake or anything like that, right? And I think that that's really important to keep in mind, is because we're going to be looking at, the teachings of a teacher outside the Dalai Lama's main lineage. And this is something that, the Dalai Lama has taken an approach that, although he's very much in the Gelugpa tradition, a strong advocate and expert of the Tsongkhapa, J Rinpoche's thought, that he believes that there are awakened beings in all the different lineages, and that means that there must be within those lineages, Nyingma, Kagyu, Sakya, Gelugpa, there must be within these lineages methods or techniques for attaining enlightenment. He said that, and so it's the intellectual challenge for him is to explain how these people who would seem to have a totally wrong view from the point of view of Tsongkhapa, nonetheless have a practice that in some way brings them to the antidote or the remedy to cyclic existence that Tsongkhapa was teaching. Yeah, it's similar to the Catholic idea, Roman Catholic idea of anonymous Christians, that they're people who don't know or don't have faith in Jesus Christ, but nonetheless can be saved because whatever we think that spirit of Jesus Christ is, they have it as very good, kind, loving Hindus or whatever, right? So in the same kind of vein, His Holiness is super knowledgeable about all these different traditions. The first time I encountered His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, was in 1985 when I went to see him at his residence in Dharamsala. I got an appointment, and as I was coming into my appointment, there was a Nyingma Lama coming out. You say in monastic robes, and he had just been giving the Dalai Lama a lesson in, I don't know, something from the Nyingma tradition. So I just thought I would point that out because we're going to be, trying to learn a little bit about what that was about. So here's our guy, Jamgon Ju Mipham Gyatso. Sometimes people spell Mipam with an H in it, which is a little closer to representing the Tibetan letters, but it's pronounced Mipam. When we see a P in English, we put a little puff of breath after the P, right? And that's what the H does. So if we just say Mipam, we're saying it right. So we're going to learn more about him. So he lived from 1846 to 1912. So he lived into the 20th century. He actually, at the end of his lifetime was the fall of the Qing dynasty, the last Chinese empire. And this is relevant because he lived in the kingdom of Derge, which is in Kham, Eastern Tibet, and now, of course, part of the People's Republic of China. But this had been a, independent or semi-independent kingdom, Derge, for many centuries. And they particularly specialized in Derge in reproducing Tibetan texts, carving wood blocks from which you could print Tibetan texts. And the palace of the kings of Derge has been destroyed a long time ago, but the Parkhong, the publishing house where they carve these wooden blocks to print texts, is still there and still in operation. Mipam was part of the Nyingma tradition, which is, the oldest tradition of Tibetan Buddhism going back to the 8th century. And he's also often identified with the Rimé tradition. Rimé means non-sectarian. So we're not going to especially focus on deciding who's non-sectarian and who isn't non-sectarian. This is not something I've heard from anybody else, but I feel like listening to the many talks, by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, that he's in some sense really a non-sectarian Tibetan Buddhist. For example, the statement, that there are enlightened masters in all of the different traditions. This is not something that you'll hear from the abbots of many of the Tibetan monasteries, for example, right? Because many Gelugpas are invested in protecting the preciousness of the special lineage of teachings of Tsongkhapa. And whereas His Holiness has mastered all of that material, and yet opened his mind to the possibility that even though different words are being used, and even sometimes contradictory words, that when people are penetrating the meaning of these words deeply and meditating them on them, they can come to the same kind of awakening. We'll talk more about Rimé later. It's at least debatable as to whether Mipam should be included in the Rimé movement or not. But anyway, he was clearly one of Tibet's greatest scholars and teachers, and I think worthy of our attention. In the Nyingma tradition, there have been, frankly, there are many teachers, right, that are very important to the tradition, within the tradition. But in terms of our interests from a Gelugpa point of view, there really are only a few, because most Nyingma teachers did not really engage with philosophy. They didn't necessarily understand the kind of analytic philosophy, the importance of reason in the process of meditation, these kinds of things that are so important in the Gelugpa tradition. Many Nyingmas had no regard for these kinds of pursuits, and in fact scorned them. And there are a few teachers, just 3 basically, that are well known, who are not like that, but in fact had their own sort of sophisticated understanding of reason and how it fit into a contemplative Buddhist practice. And the first of those guys is named Rongsom Shirgisangbo, and we don't know his exact dates, but he lived in the 11th century. There's actually some argument about exactly when he was born and how long he lived, but most of his life was in any case during the 11th century. So he lived at the same time as Atisha coming to Tibet. And Atisha knew him and considered him to be a great scholar and an incarnation of somebody named Krishnapada, who was known as a great Indian scholar who Atisha apparently knew or was aware of in India. And then in the 14th century, 14th and 15th century, the great Tibetan historian Gerlotsawa said that Rongsom was the greatest scholar. No scholar in Tibet was ever his equal. He had the strong view that the sutra tradition is inferior to the tantra or the mantra tradition, but he thought that you could use reason to establish that, and you could use reason to prove that the appearance of these things as impure is delusory, and that all these appearances are ultimately of the nature of a Buddha mandala, and that you could pursue that not by just listening to your teacher and going into some kind of trance, but that you could pursue that idea through rational analysis. And a lot of his works were lost, but some of them were saved and collected in Mipam's lifetime, and some of them have been translated. And this particular book, called Establishing Appearance as Divine, has been translated by Heidi Koppel. It's quite interesting to read. And then the other guy is Longchenpa, who lived in the 14th century, and he systematized and organized Nyingma teachings, which, they were all over the place going back to the 8th century. And he tried to organize all of this material and create systems, right, and hierarchies and categories so that things would be clear. And in particular, of course, the highest teachings in the Nyingma tradition, which are the teachings, the practices of Dzogchen, or the great completion, great perfection, the technique of meditation that we'll talk a little bit more about. And in particular, in the 13th and 14th century, you had Dolpaba, who is the, we want to say founder, although technically that's not true, but he is the popularizer of the other emptiness approach in the Jonangba school, which has so much influenced Kagyapa and some aspects of Nyingma down to today, which is a kind of approach to Buddhist philosophy that emphasizes the idea of, an absolute Buddha reality, right? Which is empty in the sense of that it's devoid of all of these impure appearances, which is, of course, is very different from the idea that Tsongkhapa had, which is that emptiness is these things lack of their own intrinsic nature. So Tsongkhapa actually, refuted Dolpaba, because Dolpaba had been was popular in his lifetime, and but that tension between, is emptiness mean that things are empty of their own nature, or does it mean that the Buddha sphere is empty of all these impure appearances? That divergence in thinking about what emptiness is goes down to today. And you can roughly say that half of the Tibetan Buddhist world, whether you're in India or Tibet or in the United States, that half of the Buddhist world thinks that emptiness means one thing, and half the Buddhist world thinks it means something quite different. But Longchenpa was, in this generation with Dolpaba, and he, at this time, there were more and more monasteries that were, becoming that monks were studying systematically, and he began to integrate that kind of scholastic approach with the great perfection. And this is quite important, that he studied for 6 years at the most important Kadamba. You understand that Gelugpa is the continuation and reformulation of the Kadamba tradition going back to Atisha. And, in the 14th century, before the time of Tsongkhapa, the most important, scholarly center of Tibetan monasticism was this place called Sangbu Neotak. And he studied there. He studied the monastic curriculum of the Kadamba tradition as it existed in the 14th century. So he wasn't, I don't say just a yogi in a cave, but it's not that he wasn't a yogi in the cave, but he wasn't only a yogi in a cave. He was also cracked the books and understood, Buddhist philosophy. And so he was able to, try to think about in a systematic way, how does Buddhist philosophy relate to these techniques of meditating on the pure nature of things as they nakedly presents itself to us. Anyway, the last thing I wanted to say is that these three guys, Rongtsompa first, and then Longchenpa, and then Mipam, they're very different they're very similar in that they all, in their own way, in their own generation, were bringing rational analysis as they understood it at their time into what's mostly known as and represents itself as primarily a contemplative tradition in Nyingma of the great perfection. But the big difference between them is that Rongtsompa and Longchenpa were both pre-Tsongkhapa. Longchenpa was actually overlapped by 6 or 7 years, with Tsongkhapa, but of course that did not allow for him to access any of Tsongkhapa's writings, right? Because they hadn't been written when Tsongkhapa was 6 or 7, right? So their idea of what integrating reason or Buddhist philosophy into Nyingma did not have the benefit of the profound insights that Tsongkhapa brought to the table, right? And this is really this is how Mipam, to me, this is what makes Mipam one of the great scholars, is that instead of saying, he's living in the 19th century, 400 years after Tsongkhapa, and he's part of a tradition that has tended to focus its attention away from rational analysis and scholarly study and composition of commentaries on sutras or shastras from India. No, it's more focused on, listening to the lamas pointing out instructions on how to perceive the pure nature of things right now, just as it is. But Mipam distinguished himself because he was super well educated in all of the traditions that had existed before and all the great texts of India in a way that's comparable to Tsongkhapa himself. As Tsongkhapa traveled around a great deal during his lifetime, he carried all these, yak loads of books, and these books were Indian texts, right? And this is the kind of approach that Mipam had, is trying to actually understand the teachings that had been transmitted from India, but then interpret them from a Nyingma point of view. So I guess what I'm saying is he had the advantage of knowing what Tsongkhapa said, whereas Tsongkhapa did not have the advantage of knowing what Mipam said, right? And instead of just saying, yeah, Tsongkhapa was wrong about everything, he understood, in my opinion, this is my opinion, right? I think he understood exactly what Tsongkhapa was doing, or largely understood what Tsongkhapa was doing, and tried to, instead of just simply refuting it, he tried to assimilate it and transcend it. And how would he transcend it? He would transcend it through focusing on integrating into his philosophy the idea of this great perfection teachings. That's the idea. Okay, so that's my that's that. Let's see. I haven't done this for a while, so I forgot to do that. Stop sharing. There's the stop sharing button. Okay. Now I'm going to share something different. Okay, this is the book. And I would really recommend, if you're going to come to these classes over the next few weeks, that you try to get this book. I have the title page here, Jamgon Mipam, His Life and Teachings by Douglas Duckworth, from a book written in 2011. I just put this up here so you could see this is the book. And it's very authoritative and also very readable and accessible. If you know enough about Buddhism to bother to show up to this talk, you will understand this book. You don't have to know Tibetan. And Douglas writes very well, and he totally knows what he's talking about. He's not only studied with, he studied with many, many lamas. If you look at all of the, what do you say, acknowledgement section. And I happen to know personally that he's not only studied with a great many Nyingma lamas, that he's also studied with Gelugpa lamas as well. That's not what he mostly writes about. Okay, so I just want to, for the rest of the time tonight, just look through kind of some of the introductory material in the first chapter from this book, and then we'll maybe suggest that you read the first parts of the second chapter, and depending on how much time we have, I might skip toward the end of the second chapter. Okay, so Mipam shaped the trajectory of the Nyingma school, right? Duckworth says he's in a class of himself, and his works live today as part of the curriculum of study at several contemporary monastic colleges in Tibet, India, and Nepal. Well, what do you know? There are such things as Nyingma monastic colleges. And what do they teach people in these Nyingma monastic colleges? It seems like, for a long time, there wasn't any separate introduction to basic Buddhist philosophy from a Nyingma point of view. And people would, in these, pre-Mipam, people would integrate into the curriculum at these monasteries materials that were not really native to the Nyingma tradition, had not integrated the great perfection into their perspective. And what Mipam did was he wrote, say, about Chandrakirti or Shantideva or Shantarakshita. He wrote about these great scholarly texts from India, but he wrote about them from a Nyingma point of view. And so his texts have become the important ones in educating, young Nyingma scholars today. Yeah, he says, although he lived quite late in the history of Buddhist development in Tibet, his influence has been enormous. So living quite late is true, right? He's lived into the 20th century. But what I'm suggesting, what I'm trying to suggest is that was actually an advantage to him in a way, because he was able to look back on so much and try to integrate and synthesize things. So Duckworth points out that he spent most of his life in meditation, but at the same time was like a prolific scholar. It's, when you see these people like, I don't know, Mozart or Tsongkhapa or something like that, they seem to be able to achieve, super ordinary kinds of degrees of activity or mastery. And when you read biographies of great Tibetan teachers, they're almost always prodigies to such a degree that it becomes, you can't always believe what you're reading. So he spent most of his life in meditation retreat, but wrote extensively on a very wide range of scriptures and traditions, and addresses all kinds of topics. Then, so after we learn a little bit about Mipam's life, then in the next section, Duckworth talks about his interpretation of Buddhist philosophy, especially emptiness and the two truths. And then the third part of this book has just an amazing little anthology of, it's sort of Mipam's greatest hits, or these sort of selected beautiful translations from Mipam's writings. And it would be impossible for us to go through all of those, but we'll definitely be looking at some of them. So he created a grand synthesis. That's a way to put it. Yeah. And he says he spent so much of his life in meditation retreat, but his philosophical writings are deeply rooted in experiential orientation and can be read as quintessential instructions for Buddhist practice. Okay. So that's how he introduces the book. Mipam, Jew. So why is he Jew? Mipam, Jew is a clan name, right? So it's his family lineage. His father was a member of this distinguished Jew clan that was supposedly descended from the deities that came down on a rope from the sky, right? And his mother was the daughter of a minister in the kingdom of Derge. And so, yeah, Derge was an important center of culture in Eastern Tibet in the 19th century. Yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about Eastern Tibet, but Eastern Tibet was not, and probably could say is still not, an area in which Gelugpa is especially strong. And there were a lot, it's not absent, but there was a lot of Kagyapa and Nyingma and some Sakya scholars who were active and interacting. And they were far enough away from Lhasa that they usually could flourish independently without threat of their monasteries being closed down if they had the wrong view or something like that. And that's the area where this non-sectarian tradition developed. Some people think of the non-sectarian tradition, although it's supposed to include Gelugpa as well as the others, but in some ways, it's a counterweight to the power that the Gelugpa tradition had, and that these other traditions were, like, what do you say, collaborating or joining forces in some way, being more tolerant of each other's works so that they could form a counterbalance to Gelugpa power. So yeah, as Duckworth says, he was a prodigy, but read the biographies of any of these great teachers and you find the same thing. And so then, yeah, he summarizes some of his prodigious accomplishments, memorizing texts when he was 6, became unobstructed in reading and writing when he was 10. And interestingly, yeah, he wrote a Tibetan commentary on the Kama Sutra, which Gendon Sherbo is, if you read Don Lopez's book, The Madman's Middle Way, Gendon Sherbo is quite famous for having studied in both Gelugpa and non-Gelugpa traditions and kind of written a critique of Gelugpa from outside. And he also wrote a commentary on the Kama Sutra as a Tibetan. But as he points out, that Mipam had previously, and was in fact the first Tibetan to write a commentary on the Kama Sutra. Anyway, yeah, he became a monk when he was 12 and was a amazing scholar even when he was from little, formed a connection and retreat with Manjushri, and then seemed after that to have this amazing capacity to just receive a lung. I don't know if a lung is a transmission of a scripture where the teacher just reads the book to you and without stopping and explaining it in detail, but then you have received the transmission, right, of that text. That's called a lung. And for most of us, receiving a lung, although it technically authorizes you've received a transmission, it doesn't mean that you actually understand what you received. But this was like a feat, because we'll say what feat, F-E-A-T, that he had was that, from when he was a teenager, he could receive these lungs and then understand most texts in that way and even write commentaries on them, right, without having had somebody else explain it to him. Okay, so for political reasons, there was a civil war, and Derge was temporarily taken over, by some rebels, and then the government of Derge called in the 13th Dalai Lama to send troops to restore the kingdom of Derge, and so there was fighting in his homeland, and he took this advantage to this opportunity to go on a pilgrimage to Lhasa at the age of 18 or 19, along with his uncle. And this is very important because, as I mentioned, that Longchenpa studied for 6 years at the center of Kadamba learning in the 14th century. Well, like this, Mipam stayed at a Gelugpa monastery in Lhasa for about a month, but apparently that was all it took for him to, get the idea that there was something important going on there, right? He was exposed to the Gelugpa tradition and also to the practice of debate among monks as part of a scholarly practice. So this is an important paragraph that I put in pink here. Mipam's work became influential. This can be attributed to the fact that he was able to formulate a viable alternative to the Gelugpa interpretation, which had monopolized the intellectual traditions of Buddhism in central Tibet since the 17th century. Yet his works directly challenged Gelugpa hegemony on monastic education. And this is a sentence that's important for me. While his writings contested central aspects distinctive to Gelugpa, he also incorporated significant features of Gelugpa thought into his own work. So this is why he's philosophically important. If he was just saying the great perfection, the great perfection, the great perfection, and forget all that conceptual logic stuff, then it wouldn't be interesting. But he seems to have actually understood what Tsongkhapa was doing. At least that's my opinion reading his book. And then had his own way of disagreeing with it. But yeah, from within a context of real engagement. Yeah, so he goes on to talk about how this guy spent most of his time in meditation retreat and was able to very fluently compose these amazing texts on breaks from these retreats, including texts, Chandrakirti, just on these reading transmissions. He could compose these. Famously, an important commentary on the wisdom chapter of the Bodhisattvacharya Avatar. So his two main teachers were Jamgon Kongtrul and Jamyang Khyentse Wangbo. These are both 19th century scholars of Eastern Tibet that were associated, I think, pretty clearly with the remade tradition. So his teachers were versed, even, they have a certain lineage, but they were versed in the teachings of more than just one lineage. They were practitioners of kind of an ecumenical approach or inclusive approach to Buddhist thought. This is interesting. One of all these amazing things. In his lifetime, Mipam is said to have read the entire collection of the translated words of the Buddha translated into Tibetan, which is 108 volumes, 108 large volumes, thick volumes, and he's supposed to have read the whole thing 7 times. It's very interesting. Yeah, makes me a little curious. Did he really read it 7 times? And if he did, why did he have to read it 7 times? Did he have trouble understanding the first 6, or was it just like a practice of virtue? Anyway, as I said, this is very interesting. It says he found the texts of the new translations easy to understand, but the texts of old translations from his own Nyingma school were difficult. So this refers to the fact there are different waves or generations of translations of Buddhist texts. And the earlier translators, right, may not have, well, they didn't understand these texts in the same way that they were understood later. And I think it might be fair to say that in some cases, the earlier translators, in a good faith, translated the text as best they could, but may not have understood them as well as later translators did. And probably the same thing has happened with the transmission of Buddhist texts from Asia to the United States and Europe as well, right? It takes a while to understand what you're working with, right? Yeah. So Duckworth makes the point that although Mipam is considered non-sectarian or rime, right, he insisted that all of the most profound points are found, within the translations of the Nyingma school. And he says there is a strong sectarian identity in Mipam's work. He showed respect for the different sects in Tibet, but did not gloss over their differences. Yeah, it's hard to know how to balance this. When you think about His Holiness the Dalai Lama, he doesn't, I don't think he glosses over the differences between the sects, but I don't know if you would say how strong his sectarian identity is. He thinks that Tsongkhapa is right, and he has a hermeneutic, a charitable hermeneutic, in the sense that when he reads texts from other schools, instead of saying, oh, this is wrong because that's not what Tsongkhapa says, he tries to find ways in which there's wisdom in these other ways of formulating, using words, right? I don't know if you consider that glossing over differences. I think His Holiness sharply recognizes that there are real differences, and that it's not the case that all teachers in Tibetan Buddhism have, the correct view. Yeah. So it says that Mipam felt that in his generation, that the Nyingma tradition was on the verge of becoming like a painted butter lamp and an artifact without much power, right? And that few people wondered about the philosophy of Nyingma or knew anything about it. And right. So that was what he did. He would write commentaries on philosophical texts, both contemplative texts and philosophical texts, but from a Nyingma point of view. And not all besides Gelugpa scholars who argued with him, right, about his interpretations, there were also Nyingma scholars who both then and later disagreed with him because they thought he was engaging in too much conceptual discourse, right? By absorbing a little bit too much Gelugpa for many people's taste, put it that way. He was also a practitioner of debate, which, right, he originally saw being practiced there at in his visit to Lhasa. There's some description of some debates that he had, some correspondence that he had with Gelugpa, friend / adversary in Lhasa, also debates that he had within Nyingma. Yeah, and this is what Duckworth's sort of key point, I think, in this book is that, that it's the interplay between rational analysis and the transcendence of reason that's sort of characteristic of Mipam's work. Think about it like, just step back from this for a second and think about it as like, in the Gelugpa tradition, the idea is that you have to understand what emptiness is, and then you have to use reason to analyze in such a way that you gain a certainty or an ascertainment, right, about emptiness, and to recognize that emptiness with a real sense of certainty or conviction with regard to your own self, right? But then this is all still at the level of conceptuality, and then stabilize your mind on what you have understood through that in that analytical process. And through a process of alternating, stabilizing your mind and then analyzing, stabilizing your mind and analyzing, according to the tradition, right? You reach the point where you directly perceive, you're no longer conceptually, inferentially realizing emptiness. You're directly perceiving the emptiness of things. And in the Gelugpa tradition, when you directly perceive the emptiness of things, the emptiness that you're perceiving is the emptiness that you previously were understanding through mediated by a conception. But in the experience of directly seeing emptiness, right, this is Tsongkhapa's tradition, the experience of directly seeing emptiness, you don't sit there thinking, wow, I finally saw emptiness, right? Because at that time, there's a vanishing of all dualistic appearance. There's not a sense of I, the subject, yogi here, am realizing emptiness, which is my object. It's like, yeah, sometimes we have degrees of experience maybe in life where sometimes our ordinary sense of dualistic separation between subject and object gets weaker than usual. This is the idea of the utter eradication of any sense of duality at all, right? So the idea that, oh, I just realized emptiness does not arise when you're realizing emptiness, right? So what, and so it's posited by Gelugpas that when you emerge from this meditation, you then look back on it and say, wow, I just realized emptiness. And now I have seen with my mind directly that emptiness exists, right? But that's only after you come out of the meditation, right? So what we're going to see in Mipam's system is that this is not the way he sees the matter. Because the experience of directly knowing reality is so different from the process of conceptual analysis, he sees rational analysis and conceptual thought used correctly, right, as, what do you say, bringing you to the threshold of insight. You could see it's realizing emptiness, but it's not realizing authentically the true nature of reality. Realizing the emptiness, the sheer emptiness of intrinsic nature of things, that's not the true nature of reality as you experience it in yogic meditation. So in a way, it's like, and this isn't unique to Mipam to say that the object of nirvana, that nirvana, the realization of nirvana, non-dualistic liberation consciousness, that this does not realize the same, does not know or experience the same object that is known in rational analysis. It's quite common outside the Gelugpa school to say that can't be the same because it feels completely different. If it's not, it doesn't feel anything like that at all, right? So yeah, in the Gelugpa school, they say, oh, it's the same object, but your mode of realization is different. And in other schools, focusing more on that subjective experience, it just feels like and seems like and is described as a completely different thing that realizing emptiness was a stepping stone to, but is profoundly different from it. Yeah. And so for the Nyingma tradition, the great perfection embodies the culmination of Tantra. And Tantra has a unique philosophical dimension that contrasts with the way it's considered in the Gelugpa school. So as I'm not really focusing on, Tantra or the Nyingma interpretation of Tantra, but this is an important point. When we in Gelugpa talk about Tantra, we're thinking about deity yoga, because as Tsongkhapa argues very systematically and thoroughly and carefully in his great exposition of secret mantra, right, Ngakarim Chemo, the key distinguishing feature of Tantra is deity yoga. And he argues that this is in all tantras and that this method of taking on the form of the teacher, which is a quote he gets from one of the tantras, that the method is to take on the form of the teacher, right? And that's what distinguishes tantra from sutra, is this special method. And of course, Tsongkhapa argues that the object of realization, the philosophy of what your wisdom consciousness is the same. You have to realize emptiness, and the emptiness you realize is not some special tantric emptiness, right? It is the emptiness that you've been studying in the sutras and the shastras and the teachings of Chandrakirti and Nagarjuna. So the Nyingma tradition, it's not as though they don't know about deity yoga, right? In Kagyupa or in Nyingma, they know about deity yoga. People do practice deity yoga, but all of these tantras that Tsongkhapa is engaged with and cites as embodying this idea that deity yoga, visualizing yourself as being a fully awakened Buddha as a technique to become a fully awakened Buddha, that these are, what do you say, lower type, they're all lower types of practices. And that the highest form of tantric practice, called the great perfection, does not involve that kind of technique at all. The first time I talked to somebody who was, coming out of this practice tradition about what their practice was, I was naive and shocked to understand that they did not know what deity yoga was, right? Yeah, it wasn't part of their practice. Yeah. So this is what Duckworth is saying here. Gelugpa tradition says that the difference between sutra and tantra relates to methods of meditation, that is deity yoga, not to a philosophical view, right? Nyingma tradition considers the view in tantra to go further than sutra through a distinctive approach to the nature of experience and subjectivity, which he's going to talk more about later. On the other hand, Mipam says that you have to understand Madhyamaka. You have to understand Buddhist philosophy of Chandrakirti and Nagarjuna in order to understand the great perfection. You have to understand the great perfection in order to practice the great perfection. So people who, Nyingma, there were many Nyingmapas then, and I would take it even now, who really disagree with that and think that, studying philosophy is getting you farther away from reality rather than closer, right? He said others in the tradition who weren't into scholarship, right, did not always agree with Mipam's particular exposition. Yeah. But importantly, before Mipam, there wasn't any body of Nyingma commentary on sutra topics. People just didn't bother with that, right? And so when they studied sutra topics in monasteries, they had to borrow from the Gelugpa tradition or others. So Mipam creates this distinctively Nyingma interpretation. Now, when you read Tsongkhapa, like you read Lamrim Chemu, the great treatise on the stage of the path to awakening by Tsongkhapa, when you read this, he mentions Tantra in it at the very end. and the end is like, when you do all this, you do all these practices, this should prepare you to enter into the practice of secret mantra. And this is how, you should find a qualified teacher and get going on that. It's like, just less than one page, right? And he doesn't in any of this text, any part of his philosophical works, in his commentaries on Nagarjuna or his explanations of the stages of the path, he doesn't ever say, oh yeah, and here's a tantric perspective on this. This is what such and such a tantra says about this philosophical point. He never does that, right? He keeps these as separate lineages, the Tantric and Sutra teachings. And, not everybody does this. Going back to the Jonangpa school, Dolboba, it did exactly the opposite. He said all of Buddha's works can be taken as explanations of all of Buddha's works, and we can use Tantra to interpret Sutra anytime we want. And Mipam was, I would say in some ways, he was like Dolboba in that regard. I mean, he was bringing a tantric, which for him meant a Dzogchen perspective, into his way of understanding sutras. Yeah. So Gendon Shirbel, whom I mentioned earlier as, the 20th century renegade, the mad monk, who studied Gelugpa and rejected it. He wrote a commentary on the Kama Sutra. He was asked who he thought was greater between Mipam and Tsongkhapa. Now, I find it more interesting that he was asked that question rather than what his particular answer is, because the fact that somebody said to somebody who would be in a position to know, because he's studied in these different schools, which do you think was greater, Mipam or Tsongkhapa? It implies that the questioner is thinking, okay, these are the two greatest people, which is kind of my own personal opinion. And maybe I will have a different opinion at a different time. But this is the person. I think Tsongkhapa is one of the greatest philosophers in the history of the world. And I think within the history of Tibetan Buddhism, whether we agree with him or not, Mipam is probably the second greatest. So anyway, what Gendon Shirbel says, Tsongkhapa spent a lot of time around monks, so we probably win a debate, but Mipam's force of reason, power of understanding, and manner of expression is more awesome, right? Anyway, so he was a good debater, had a special connection with Manjushri, as mentioned earlier. Spent 13 years in a meditation retreat in a cave known as the Tiger Den. So he was, not abandoning meditation for philosophy. So in one of these retreats, apparently he was doing deity yoga, right? Visualizing the deity, visualizing himself as the deity, right? In a very serious way. And when he came out and reported this to his teacher said, "Oh, that's hard. Yeah. Should rest naturally without doing anything." Yeah. By doing deity yoga, I never saw any natural face of mine with a white complexion and rosy cheeks. But if I were to die right now, I would not have the slightest fear. So the implication is that the Dzogchen practice, directly seeing the face of reality, right? The natural face of your mind, right? Is an easier and more profound practice than deity yoga, right? So that was his teacher, Jamgon Khyentse Wangbo's words. Points to the uncontrived style of meditation in the Great Perfection, in contrast to a gradual approach that seeks out conclusions through logical analysis, or an approach focused on meditation practices or the generation that contrive the deity and visualization. The practice of the effortless and natural great perfection is the direct way to recognize the nature of the mind. Right. That's the general idea. Although, as we'll see, right, and I think we have already mentioned, in his mature thought, Mipam did not think that one should discard logical analysis, but rather you had to understand Madhyamaka analysis as a stepping stone to understanding the Great Perfection. So here is the Great Perfection. Great Perfection affirms the nature of mind right now is the Buddha. In a fundamental sense, everyone is always already a Buddha. So no contrived, that is, faked up kind of striving effort. is going to alter this natural state to produce some, you know, Buddha at a future time. Contrived effort gets in the way of actualizing our true nature. Yeah. Wisdom and compassion shine forth as the natural outflow of the empty and aware ground of being without the need for forcible creation or contrivance. It's very important. I consider this is just my opinion, right? I consider this to be a powerful medicine in the Dharma pharmacy. It happens not to be the medicine that I personally most powerfully connected with, or I personally have found most helpful. But what do you say? Recognize that I'm not the center of the universe. I'm not the only person that matters. And the reason this teaching persists and is so popular, right, is because it has helped so many people, right? Yeah. I think I might have told the story sometime about a Kagyupa teacher in India who's getting ready to come to America to teach, and he asked his teacher, "What am I going to tell all of those Americans?" Right? And his teacher said, "Tell them they are all Buddhas," right? And like, you know, coming from a Yalupa point of view, my mind is reeling, you know, it's like, but you have to like just sort of bracket that for a second and think about what kind of medicine is that? You know, that's sort of a powerful, if you think about, you know, self-esteem, you know, overcoming self-loathing, cultivating the idea that there's some fundamental goodness in every person. These are really powerful ideas that can be the healing medicine that some people really need. That's my opinion. Yeah. Yeah. So his writings were not ordinary compositions. They were inspired works that came to be considered mind treasures. So, you know, in the Nyingma tradition, there's this big thing about finding treasure texts, actual texts that are found inside rocks or inside statues or behind a wall or something like this. And then by extrapolation from this idea that texts that were left by Padmasambhava or Yeshe Tsogyal or somebody in you know, past centuries, and were left there to be revealed or deciphered at a later time. There comes to, by extrapolation, to be the idea that there can be texts that are buried within our minds, right? And that's the idea. Mipam was not one of these treasure texts people that went around finding secret texts like Joseph Smith or something, finding the Book of Mormon. He wasn't doing that, but his writings were so inspired that people later, you know, thought of them as like, yeah, words of Buddha that were coming out of his mind. Yeah, he says, the will to write dawned naturally, and I have no choice but to write. You know, it sort of reminds one of the automatic writing tradition in early America. You know. Mm-hmm. Another thing that's really interesting is that Mipam was not a tulku. He was not a Rinpoche. He was never endorsed during his lifetime as an incarnate Lama. It's so interesting that, you know, incarnate Lama is so important in Tibetan Buddhism and in Nyingma as well. And treasure texts are so important in Nyingma. And he wasn't either of these things. Of course, after the fact, right, his works were recognized as mind treasures. And indeed, they did go around finding reincarnations of him, even though he seemed to have discouraged that idea. Mipam is reported to say he would not take birth again in impure realms. So that's what was reported, right? But nevertheless, people went and found various reincarnations of him, of course. How could they not? So Duckworth concludes by saying, how does his statement that he would not be born again in an impure realm concur with his being a bodhisattva who vows to take birth, everywhere that beings are suffering, as long as they're suffering, to free them from suffering, right? And so then he concludes this chapter by saying, well, we could resolve this apparent contradiction by talking about pure perception. There are no impure realms. They're just impure ways of seeing. And that, it's a tantric practice to regard this as the mandala, just to regard one's own body, right, as a divine body, to regard one's environment as a pure land. I don't know if any of you have actually read the Vimalakirti Nirdesha Sutra of this, but it's a nice translation by Bob Thurman, for example. And it's quite extraordinary because this is a sutra, not a tantra. But in this text, there are many things that seem tantra-like in a number of ways. And one of them is when there's a conversation between Buddha and some of his followers about, our being in this funky land, where lots of stuff stinks and bodies rot and so forth, and how different that is from the Pure Land. And the Buddha said, well, no, this is a Pure Land too, if you know how to see it. And then he presses his toe on a little button. It's just in my mind, but presses his toe on the ground or something. It's and then suddenly, people are able to see the world as he sees it, as a perfect, our world, seeing the world with pure perception. And so this is, a tantric practice. And and this is maybe, I'm going to stop here in a second, but this is very relevant to where one of the things I find most interesting about this, because, okay, so we know that things appear to us as though they had their own nature, and that when we analyze, we can find ultimately there isn't any essential nature that we can grasp or pin down, and that our tendency to grasp after a nature that isn't there is the way we cause and persistently, recurrently draw ourselves back into suffering, right? So to be liberated, we have to see emptiness, the fact that things are devoid of the kind of intrinsic existence we're attributing to them, right? But suppose we proceed along the path and attain to the vision of the mandala, right? We attain to pure perception that the Buddha was manifesting in the Vimalakirti Sutra. Besides there being emptiness as the real nature of things, it turns out that there's a different kind of conventional nature of things, right? There's the kind of beauty and perfection of the Pure Land, right? Which is in some sense how all these things are, but is not how we see them, right? And so do you see what I'm saying? It's almost like there's, besides the conventional truth and the ultimate truth, there's this sort of other conventional truth, which is the pure conventional truth, right? And this idea is seems inadequately philosophized in Gelugpa, and this is a kind of area that Mipam is very comfortable moving into and developing a schema for talking about that you don't readily find in Gelugpa teachings. Yeah. And that's enough for me for today. I will be happy to take any comments or questions. Oh yeah, just in terms of going forward. So chapter 2 of this book, the first 90% of it is like an introduction to the history of Buddhist philosophy that's very, very readable and very accessible. Even if you already know what Dharmakirti said, what Chandrakirti said, if you already know what Asanga was all about, you should still read it anyway, because he explains these things so clearly and so beautifully. But I was thinking of, just suggesting that you get the book and read that, and to pass over that and start at the end of chapter 2, and then move on to the chapter 3 next time. Okay. Hold on a second. Yeah, that's it for tonight. Any comments or questions? Yes, there's somebody raising their hand. Ask to unmute.
I'm unmuted, thank you. I was just curious. I happened to see this on a Facebook event, and I was like, "Oh, this sounds so wonderful," because I'm such a huge fan of Mipam.
Oh, you are? Oh,
He
great.
blows my
Yeah.
mind, but I also practice in the Nyingma tradition, and I'm not smart enough to study all the schools. But I was just curious. Meaning in the sense, like, I don't study Tsongkhapa, I don't, but I was curious what compelled you to want to give a class on Mipam when your primary love is Tsongkhapa. So I was just interested and curious about that.
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, it's not masochism. So, I'm about to turn 69, and I think I gained an appreciation of how Tsongkhapa's system worked more than 35 years ago. And I've been engaged with it, particularly in terms of the philosophical aspects of it, trying to understand exactly what his view of emptiness is and how to explain it to people and how it relates to the idea of reliable cognition. And then I kind of have made most of my career around either translating texts that have to do with that or making scholarly explanations of such texts, and then also writing less scholarly or more accessible, more general, you say, guidance into this kind of view, like the book Introduction to Emptiness, for example. But, as I've gotten older and had more experience and seen things from different points of view and reflected on the things that the Dalai Lama has said, I've wanted to learn more about the perspectives of other schools. In fact, I didn't think about this in this, giving myself this assignment. But when I first met His Holiness the Dalai Lama in 1985 at his residence, when I was describing, he told me that instead of just doing my dissertation on conventional and ultimate truth in Gelugpa, I should do it on the conventional ultimate truth in all 4 schools of Tibetan Buddhism, including Sutra and Tantric perspectives. And I did not do that simply because I felt that that was far beyond my ability. And frankly, it's still beyond my ability even now. But his the challenge of his inclusive, or you say ecumenical approach to different types of Tibetan Buddhism, and how scholars from different traditions forcefully argue and debate and refute one another. And His Holiness likes to say, yeah, but great scholars use different words, but if they're also practitioners, they will often come to understand that the meaning behind these words is the same. So yeah, I'm curious about things like that. And I'm not trying to assert that Mipam and Tsongkhapa are saying the same things in different words. But I'm curious to try to learn more about Mipam's system and how it compares to Tsongkhapa's. So it's sort of like an assignment that I gave myself. I have all of my own personal spiritual teachers have been in the Gelugpa tradition. They've been from different monastic colleges, but they were all Gelugpas. I've never studied with a Nyingma teacher and never had any introduction to the great perfection. So in that way, I'm grossly unqualified to do this. And yeah, I'm doing it anyway.
Thanks. I in some ways am relatively new to Mipam, and so I read other than the Kinjuk, the Beacon of Certainty, and I have to say, wow, I studied it for 3 months, and every single day, I've never been a text that blew my mind every single day. Yeah. So
well,
I imagine you feel the same way about Tsongkhapa.
Oh yeah, Tsongkhapa. Well, yeah, they're both great geniuses and philosophically, and also they're profound spiritual teachers, and they're also beautiful writers. All three of these things. And I was just reading an article by Thupten Jimba, who's the Dalai Lama's principal English translator for decades now, who's a brilliant, brilliant man. And I was just reading an article that he has coming out, and in a footnote to the article, he discusses Beacon of Certainty, actually, and he's talking about how much he thinks that huge sections of Beacon of Certainty were influenced by Mipam's deep understanding of what Tsongkhapa was doing. In other words, you see sometimes when people argue against someone else without really taking the trouble to understand what they're saying. And so that's not the case here. Mipam, I think he really understood what Tsongkhapa was saying, and he was trying to say something further, because and in that way he has an advantage on Tsongkhapa. Do you see what I'm saying? Because Tsongkhapa can't read Mipam and turn the tables on. Yeah. Oh, is somebody else? Sorry.
Yeah, yep. My virtual hand. My name is Jay. I'm in South Australia, obviously.
I see. Yes.
I really, really am so delighted and grateful to you and to Shanti Deva for providing this opportunity, because I'm a strong advocate of comparative religion, and it's wonderful to get another input, a different point of view. So thank you so much. It's inspiring.
Yeah, thank you for attending. I really appreciate it. By coming, you're giving me an opportunity to learn more about Mipam.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
Yeah, okay. So my English isn't very good. And I'm not, I don't read as much But my understanding is that many of the yogi that practice the great perfection, like in Tibet,
Yeah.
all this it's much more of an oral tradition. And so not too many people are literate, like they don't read. Therefore, I just want to make myself clear when you were saying that Mipam had stressed that it is important for one to kind of really understand the Mithya. So I just wondered, now, if they don't have that kind of, like years of debating experience of really sharpened the understanding of emptiness, so how would the yogi then come to a realization of emptiness?
Yeah. Well, I don't know is the best answer. I think, there are these two traditions of yogic contemplative approach and scholasticism, study, reason. And Gelugpa is most identified with the scholastic and rational and analytical side, and Nyingma is most identified with the contemplative side. And it's when you are looking from a Gelugpa point of view at the Nyingma tradition, and many people are saying, just relax, you're naturally already a Buddha, don't worry, be happy. It's a little hard to understand what the philosophical content of this is. If it either connects with you or it doesn't. And that's why I think people like Longchenpa, and especially Ju Mipam, are really important, because they're fully engaged in dialogue with philosophy. They understand the texts, they understand the arguments, and then they present a distinctive point of view that there's an authentic transconceptual, experience that is natural to us, which goes beyond the idea of things being empty of an intrinsic existence. And yeah, so this is how I engage with it. I think from what I'm getting from Douglas Duckworth's book is that many young Nyingma monks are getting education these days because they can get education within the Nyingma tradition. They can get education in Buddhist philosophy without having to go outside the Nyingma tradition. But it's true that there are many people, and there have been for many centuries, who would say that all of this discursiveness is taking you farther away from reality. And this point of view is presented in many different forms, actually, in Tsongkhapa's own writings. And he forcefully stands against this idea that just by making the mind blank, you can become a Buddha. So I guess that's why I would, coming from a Gelugpa point of view, I find a point of contact in Mipam that I don't find in maybe, other Nyingma teachers.
I think there's a lot of validity, because in Mahayana Buddhism, whether it is the Diamond Sutra or the Heart Sutra, I think over and over again, the person is subjected to question, what is mind, in order to get back to the nature of mind. And I think, if the whole practice, if one is able to kind of be more clear, I mean, everything is purity and clarity. And I guess, that would kind of propel one into a higher state of realization. I don't know. I'm just
Oh, no,
wondering.
I understand what you're saying. Yeah,
Yeah.
I had an opportunity to spend, I don't know, many hours together with a Nepalese man who is a student of Mingyur Rinpoche. And I mean, he tried to describe, what their instructions were and what the practices were. And yeah, it is along that line. The idea is to first meditate on the nature of the mind, take the mind itself as an object of meditation. The mind is clear in knowing, and it's not normally that conventional nature of the mind is not something that we normally recognize or take as an object of meditation. So he said, well, that's the first thing. You have to, learn to stabilize your mind on the conventional nature of the mind. And then that's a starting point for recognizing the ultimate nature of the mind, as perfect clarity, luminous clarity. And ultimately that luminous clarity is the luminous clarity of Samantabhadra, the fundamental all good Buddha that we are. That's how I understood what he was explaining.
Thank you. But I think the other thing that I found it very interesting is, with the deity meditation, there is with the higher tantra, we were introduced like the body mandala. So with the body mandala, it, one then travel within oneself, which is, I guess, what a yogi would do. But then, I think, again, it's using the mind with a conceptual method to travel. And then eventually, somehow, according to the text, there's all the knots and there is all this chakra. And if one can kind of be able to kind of get into it, or I don't know. I mean, I'm still kind of finding my way to have a better understanding, because, on one hand, I'm just thinking that, in the ancient time, if the Tibetans in those times, without the, maybe they do have diagrams, but if they don't have the written tradition, they're much more of an oral tradition. I'm just wondering, how would they be able to pass down those knowledge to help the others, to get on the path, right? I mean, we are lucky because, we have the accessibility of teachers, whereby, if we are fortunate enough, we get wonderful teachers that can help us and direct us, and with time, we kind of gradually move along the path. I'm just, I'm not so academic. I like to be, somebody that, kind of practice. And through practice, I just find that, it is, it is a practice tradition, much more, in terms of great perfection. Because I think with Tsongkhapa, there's a lot of debates, and, without the language, it is so hard. So, therefore, for us, who are not Tibetan speakers, and we are totally depending on the translation. And so much is lost in the translation because it all depends on the level of the translator to interpret, and to write out what they understand. So I just find that, like, what I'm struggling with. I mean, even for me to express myself is difficult, but I just find that, I mean, the advantage of my path is because I understand Chinese, and then through the readings of Chinese and being with the Mahayana monks, I got some teachings, and with that, like, I just find that it helps my whole understanding of the path.
Well, that's what's important. That's what I was saying from the beginning. It's like different medicines are helpful to different people. And if we're fortunate enough to find in whatever fashion, a medicine that actually, a Dharma teaching, I mean, by medicine, that's actually helping us, helping us become kinder, calmer people, so helping us to maybe be less angry, but at least importantly, less likely to act on it out of anger and so forth. This is what's really matters, I think, rather than which tradition we're following, because everybody's going to find different things really connect with them. You mentioned how in highest yoga tantra there's practices of working with inner energies and different chakras and so forth, but this is mentioned briefly later in Duckworth's book, and as I understand it, the Great Perfection teachings don't really focus on that. Instead, that's seen as part of the Anuttara Yoga, the highest yoga tantra's practice, but that Great Perfection is seen as being, just like it's higher than deity yoga, it's also higher than working with the channels as well. Anyway.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm just kind of trying to share experience, and thank you.
Yeah.
And I apologize when, like, due to my language, I'm not clear, but I mean, you have done a wonderful job. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you for attending and sharing your perspective. Okay. I think this is enough for tonight, and I will be back next Thursday at 7 p.m. Yeah. Thank you, everybody. Yeah. Thank you for listening so well. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Newland. It's really interesting. Thank you.
Bye, Sheila.
Thank you, everybody. See you next week.